My father slid a $15,000 catering invoice across the pristine white tablecloth and issued a strict ultimatum. Pay for my younger sister's wedding appetizers, or lose the college tuition fund he had been holding over my head for a decade. He truly believed he was cornering a broke student. He had absolutely no idea that I had graduated at the top of my class years ago and was currently running a financial technology empire that could buy and sell his entire existence. Before I share exactly how this high society wedding turned into a beautiful disaster, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to put a toxic family member in their place. My name is Paige. I am 33 years old, and right now I was staring at a piece of paper that perfectly summarized my family's complete delusion. We were sitting in a private dining room at one of Manhattan's most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the table, but the atmosphere was freezing. The waiter had just placed the leather check presenter on the table, and my father Richard snatched it up immediately. He did not even look at the total before sliding the heavy cardstock directly across the table to me. "Madison needs this deposit cleared by tonight," my father commanded, tapping his heavy gold ring against the invoice. "Consider it your contribution to the family, since you clearly are not contributing anything to society with that endless degree of yours." My mother Susan took a delicate sip of her martini. Her eyes raked over my unbranded navy cashmere sweater with obvious distaste. To her untrained eye, lack of visible designer logos meant cheap. "Really, Richard, do not pressure the girl. Look at her. She probably walked here from whatever shoebox apartment she is renting this month. It is embarrassing enough that she showed up to a celebratory dinner looking like a substitute teacher." Madison, my 30-year-old sister and the undisputed golden child, adjusted her engagement ring so it caught the ambient light. She sighed loudly, a practiced sound of victimhood. "It is fine, Mom. I told you we should not have invited her. She does not understand the pressure of hosting a high-profile event. DeAndre has important colleagues coming from the firm. We cannot serve cheap food just because Paige is completely broke." DeAndre, my future brother-in-law, leaned back in his leather chair with the smug satisfaction of a man who thought he owned the world. As a black man navigating the aggressive corporate ladders of Wall Street, he loved to project an image of absolute dominance. He was an investment broker at Vanguard Investments, and he made sure everyone within a 5-mile radius knew it. He smoothed the lapel of his tailored suit and flashed a condescending smile. "The markets are incredibly volatile right now, Richard," DeAndre said smoothly, shifting his gaze from my father to me. "But my portfolio is returning 20% this quarter. It takes a certain aggressive mindset to beat the street, a mindset some people simply lack." He shot his French cuffs to display a flashy, oversized watch. "Look, Paige," DeAndre continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I know things are tight when you are 33 and still hiding in a university library. I can float you the cash to save face with your parents. Let us call it a family loan. I will even give you a discount on the interest, 15% payable in 6 months. Think of it as a lesson in real-world economics." I managed to keep my face completely neutral. A lesson in economics from a man who leased his sports car and financed his lifestyle on credit. I did not mention that my company Apex Data Solutions handled risk analysis for the very hedge funds DeAndre desperately tried to impress. I knew exactly what his branch was actually worth, and it was nowhere near the illusion he was selling my parents. "I appreciate the generous offer, DeAndre," I said smoothly, picking up the invoice by the very corner, "but I will pass on the lesson, and I will not be paying this bill." I pushed the paper back across the table, sliding it until it bumped directly against my father's wineglass. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand flat on the table, making the fine silverware rattle against the china plates. "You will pay this right now, Paige, or I am freezing the tuition account tomorrow morning. Do not test me. You have been milking that fund for years, playing student while your sister is actually building a life. You either step up for this family today, or you can figure out how to pay for your own classes." "You are so ungrateful," Susan hissed, leaning forward so the other diners outside our private room would not hear her venom. "DeAndre is a Wall Street genius. He is giving Madison the life she deserves. The least you can do is contribute a fraction of what we have wasted on your useless education. You should be embarrassed sitting next to a real professional like him. Madison dramatically dropped her face into her hands, ensuring her diamond ring was still perfectly visible. You are ruining my wedding week, Paige. You are just jealous because I found a successful man and you are a complete failure. I looked at the four of them sitting there in their absolute certainty. For years, this exact tactic had worked. The constant belittling, the financial threats regarding my education, the public humiliation. They relied on tearing me down to elevate Madison. But they were operating on outdated information. They had no idea that I had stopped touching their money 5 years ago, or that the algorithm I designed was currently managing billions in assets across the global market. I calmly picked up my purse and stood from the table. You can keep the tuition fund, Dad. I said, my voice carrying clearly and calmly through the quiet dining room. I am sure DeAndre's genius investments will cover the catering. Have a wonderful dinner. I did not wait for their response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the restaurant, ignoring my father shouting my name in a harsh, demanding tone. The cool evening air of Manhattan hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. The valet immediately rushed forward to bring my car around, but I waved him off for a moment. I needed to make a phone call. I pulled my phone from my bag and dialed my chief risk officer at Apex. He answered on the first ring. Initiate a hostile audit on Vanguard Investments, I instructed, staring back at the glowing windows of the restaurant where my family was undoubtedly still complaining about my lack of ambition. Specifically the branch managed by DeAndre. Let us see exactly how much toxic debt our genius is hiding. The heavy door of my Maybach closed with a satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the chaotic noise of the Manhattan street. I settled into the plush leather seat and signaled my driver to head downtown. Before the car could even merge into traffic, my phone lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring twice, taking a slow breath to center myself before answering. I knew exactly what this was about. They were not calling to apologize. Susan did not bother with a greeting. She launched straight into her demands, her voice tight with that familiar frantic anxiety she always got when Madison was upset. She told me Madison was crying in the restaurant bathroom because my selfish behavior had ruined the celebratory mood. According to my mother, there was only one way I could make up for the severe embarrassment I had just caused the family. I needed to hand over Grandmother Eleanor's vintage diamond necklace so Madison could wear it down the aisle. I stared out the tinted window at the passing city lights. That necklace was the only thing my grandmother had left specifically to me. It was a stunning antique piece, and it held immense sentimental value. My mother argued that a priceless family heirloom belonged on the neck of a bride marrying a Wall Street titan, not gathering dust in whatever cheap shoebox apartment I was currently renting. She insisted Madison needed it to impress DeAndre's high society guests, claiming my sister's reputation was on the line, and that I owed her this sacrifice to make amends. I told her absolutely not. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she was fishing for. I stated clearly that the necklace was mine, left to me by the only person in the family who actually cared about my future, and Madison was not touching it. I could hear Susan gasp in genuine outrage. She started to scream about how I was a bitter, jealous spinster who wanted to ruin her sister's happiness. Before she could launch into another tirade about my lack of family loyalty, the phone fumbled and a deeper, harsher voice took over the line. Richard had seized the phone. My father did not waste time on guilt trips. He went straight for his favorite weapon. For as long as I could remember, Richard controlled our family through financial threats and conditional access to luxury. His ultimate bargaining chip was the family vacation estate in Aspen. It was a massive, beautiful property where we spent every winter holiday. Growing up, any minor infraction meant you were uninvited from Aspen. It was his way of keeping everyone in line, forcing us to compete for his favor, to maintain access to the wealthy lifestyle he paraded in front of us. Richard barked into the phone, his voice dripping with absolute authority. He told me that if I did not hand over that diamond necklace by tomorrow morning, I would be permanently banned from the Aspen estate. He detailed how DeAndre's prestigious family would be joining them there for the holidays this year, and how they could not have a broke failure of a sister ruining the aesthetic of their winter retreat. He told me my bedroom had already been offered to DeAndre's brother. And if I did not comply, the estate security would be given a photo of my face with strict orders to turn me away at the gate. He was so incredibly confident in his threat. He fully believed that the prospect of losing access to that house would break me. He thought I was still that desperate girl begging for a scrap of inclusion in his perfect family portrait. He went on a long rant about how I was a complete embarrassment, how I had wasted my potential, and how I should be grateful they even allowed me to associate with people of DeAndre's caliber. I did not interrupt him. I simply listened to his aggressive demands as my Maybach glided to a smooth halt in front of a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. The building was the headquarters of Apex Data Solutions, my company. My driver opened the door and I stepped out, holding the phone to my ear as Richard continued his tirade about respect and legacy. I walked through the revolving doors and crossed the expansive marble lobby. The late-night security guards immediately stood up straighter, nodding respectfully as I passed. I stepped into my private elevator, swiping my keycard to access the top floor. When the elevator doors parted, I stepped into my sprawling penthouse office. The entire floor belonged to me, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the New York City skyline. The space was sleek, modern, and screamed of quiet, untouchable wealth. My executive assistant, an incredibly efficient woman named Claire, was waiting near my mahogany desk. Despite the late hour, she was perfectly composed. She held a thick, physically bound legal dossier in her hands. She stepped forward and handed it to me, tapping the cover once to indicate that the transaction was officially complete. I flipped open the heavy folder. There, printed in crisp black ink, were the final property transfer deeds. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile and brought the phone back to my mouth. Richard was just finishing his rant, demanding a verbal confirmation that I would deliver the necklace to Madison's apartment by 9 in the morning. I walked over to the massive glass window, looking down at the city that I had quietly conquered. "Ban me from Aspen," I said, letting a soft laugh escape my lips. "That is a really funny threat, Richard, especially since you cannot ban someone from a property you no longer own." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he tried to process my words. I kept my tone light and conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. I told him that I knew he had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on the Aspen estate 2 years ago to keep up his country club appearances. I informed him that I also knew he had defaulted on those payments 6 months ago. The bank quietly foreclosed on his beloved vacation estate last week. They kept it out of the public listings to protect the property value and avoid a high-profile scandal. Richard stammered, his authoritative voice suddenly sounding thin and panicked. He demanded to know how I could possibly know about his private banking details. He insisted I was making things up to sound important, yelling that I was just a crazy, jealous woman trying to cause trouble. I ran my finger over the signature line of the legal deed in my hand. I explained that I knew about the foreclosure because my holding company purchased the distressed asset from the bank yesterday afternoon. I told him the transaction had just cleared. I am the sole legal owner of the Aspen estate. I listened as his breathing became ragged over the phone. Susan was asking him what was wrong in the background, her voice tight with panic. I did not give him a chance to formulate a lie. I told him that I had already dispatched a private security team to the property. The locks were being changed. The staff had been replaced. I advised him to cancel DeAndre's family holiday trip because if any of them showed up at my gate, my security team would have them arrested for trespassing. I told him to have a good night, ended the call, and tossed the phone onto my desk. My personal phone vibrated against the polished mahogany of my desk, jarring me from the quiet satisfaction of holding the Aspen estate deed. I glanced at the screen, a text message from DeAndre. I swiped open the notification and found a single web link followed by a heavily emoji-laden message. The link directed me to a career portal for Vanguard Investments, specifically an entry-level receptionist position at his branch. His text read, "Since you could not afford to split the appetizer bill tonight, I talked to HR. $18 an hour. You will have to fetch my coffee, but it is better than whatever you are doing now. Do not be late for the interview." I let out a short, sharp laugh. The sheer audacity of the man was almost impressive. He was sitting in a restaurant playing the billionaire benefactor while his financial house of cards was actively being dismantled by my team. I tossed the phone aside just as the frosted glass doors of my office slid open. My lead data analyst Marcus strode in alongside Claire. Marcus was clutching a secured encrypted tablet and he looked like a kid who had just cracked a safe. He tapped a few commands onto his screen, and the massive smart glass wall behind my desk instantly transformed into a glowing display of financial charts, heavily redacted client ledgers, and bleeding red profit margins. "You asked for a hostile audit of DeAndre's branch at Vanguard," Marcus said, pulling up a chair and leaning forward. "We bypassed their standard firewall protocols through the back channels we use for SEC compliance checks. Paige, it is not just bad, it is a complete bloodbath." I leaned back and crossed my arms, studying the cascading numbers. He bragged at dinner that he was returning 20% this quarter. Show me the reality. Marcus tapped the screen, isolating DeAndre's specific management portfolio. The line graph plummeted like a stone, diving into negative territory with alarming speed. "He is returning negative 12%, Marcus stated flatly. "And that is being generous. The man is not a Wall Street genius. He is a gambler who keeps betting on meme stocks and failing commercial real estate derivatives. His entire fund is severely over-leveraged and he has been masking the losses for over 8 months." I stood up and walked closer to the glass wall, my eyes tracking the desperate flow of capital. The numbers painted a vivid picture of a man drowning in his own hubris. If he is bleeding this much cash, how is he hiding it from his superiors at Vanguard? He just paid for a Michelin-starred dinner, and he is driving a brand-new leased Aston Martin. That takes liquid capital. Vanguard has automated systems to catch this exact kind of discrepancy. "He is doing it the old-fashioned way," Marcus replied, pulling up a secondary spreadsheet labeled external expenditures. "A classic Ponzi structure. He is falsifying client returns on paper, showing them phantom profits, and using new incoming investor capital to pay off anyone who tries to withdraw. But the vast majority of the incoming cash is not going into the market at all. It is going directly to his personal lifestyle." Marcus highlighted a series of transactions from the previous month. The data was crystal clear and utterly damning. DeAndre had siphoned over $200,000 of client funds into an anonymous shell LLC registered in Delaware. From that shell company, the money went straight to high-end jewelers, luxury car dealerships, and exclusive country clubs. "There it is," I said, pointing to a massive $80,000 wire transfer to a diamond broker in the Diamond District. "That is Madison's engagement ring, the one she has been shoving in my face for 6 months, bragging about how DeAndre customized it just for her. He bought it with stolen money." "Exactly," Marcus confirmed. "He is using client deposits to fund his tailored suits, his cars, his country club memberships, and his lavish wedding expenses. He is desperate to maintain the illusion of success. But a scheme like this requires constant new capital to survive." 2 days ago, the market took a sharp dip. DeAndre received margin calls he could not cover. The Vanguard automated risk system was 48 hours away from triggering a mandatory freeze on his branch. A freeze would mean an immediate internal investigation which would expose the embezzlement to the federal authorities. "So how did he stop the freeze?" I asked, analyzing the timeline on the board. "He was entirely too relaxed at dinner tonight for a man facing federal prison. If he was 48 hours away from a mandatory audit, he should have been sweating through his custom suit." Marcus's expression turned grim. He swiped to the final page of the audit. "Because he found a lifeline. Yesterday morning, a massive cash injection hit his fund. It was enough to temporarily satisfy the margin calls and reset the automated risk triggers. It bought him maybe another 30 days of breathing room." A single transaction appeared on the massive screen. It was a wire transfer for exactly $1.5 million. I stepped closer to the glass, my eyes locked on the rooting details of the originating account. My breath caught in my throat. I did not need Marcus to run a trace on those account numbers. I recognized them instantly. I had helped my father set up that specific high-yield trust account a decade ago when I was still trying to earn his respect by offering free financial advice. "Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as I stared at the irrefutable evidence. "Tell me you verified the source of this transfer." "I did," Marcus replied softly. "The $1.5 million came from a private retirement trust. The account holder is Richard." The room went dead silent. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. DeAndre had not just scammed random faceless investors. He had specifically targeted my family. He had preyed on my father's desperate need for high society status and his absolute obsession with finding a wealthy, successful son-in-law to elevate the family name. DeAndre must have panicked when the margin calls hit, realized he was about to be exposed and arrested, and convinced Richard to hand over everything he had under the guise of an exclusive investment opportunity. My father had willingly liquidated his entire life savings. The money he had spent 40 years building, the money he constantly used to threaten and control me, the exact same wealth he held over my head at dinner just hours ago. He had handed it blindly to a con artist. Richard had gambled his entire future on the very man he was currently elevating as the savior of our family legacy. Claire broke the silence, her voice tight with concern. Paige, if DeAndre's fund collapses, that money is gone. Your father will be completely bankrupt. He will lose everything. I looked down at the text message still glowing on my phone screen. The $18 an hour job offer. The smug, arrogant taunt from a man who had just robbed my parents blind to pay for his own extravagant wedding. I thought about my father sliding that catering bill across the table, demanding I empty my own pockets while he sat there entirely unaware that he had already been gutted by the man sitting next to him. He is already bankrupt, I stated, turning away from the glass wall. He just does not know it yet. DeAndre used my father's retirement to pay off toxic debt owned by a secondary hedge fund. Marcus, find out who owns that secondary debt. Marcus tapped rapidly on his tablet, his eyes scanning the data streams. It is a bundled corporate debt package, currently up for auction on the secondary market. It is distressed, so it is selling for pennies on the dollar. Buy it, I ordered without a single second of hesitation. Buy the entire package right now through Apex Data Solutions. I want to own every single cent of DeAndre's debt. Marcus raised an eyebrow but did not argue. Consider it done. I picked up my phone and drafted a reply to DeAndre's mocking job offer. I kept it brief, allowing a cold smile to spread across my face as I hit send. I think I will stick with my current position, but you should definitely keep HR on speed dial. You are going to need them very soon. The shrill ring of my phone broke the quiet of my penthouse early the next morning. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I answered already, anticipating the heavy dose of guilt she was preparing to serve. Susan did not bother saying hello. She immediately launched into a theatrical sigh, claiming that my disgraceful exit from the restaurant last night had given Madison a terrible migraine. According to my mother, if I had a single ounce of family loyalty left in my body, I would meet them at El Atelier Bridal at noon. She demanded I stand there and support my sister during her final dress fitting to make up for my utterly selfish behavior regarding the catering bill. I agreed to go. I did not agree out of guilt or obligation. I agreed because I knew exactly what my data team was doing to DeAndre's financial portfolio, and I wanted a front row seat to watch my family parade around in their delusion before the entire facade collapsed. El Atelier Bridal was a sanctuary of exorbitant Manhattan wealth. The air smelled of fresh lilies and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers illuminated racks of custom gowns, and the plush velvet seating areas were designed to make clients feel like royalty. When I walked through the heavy glass doors, the contrast between my family's projected image and my stark reality was immediate. Madison was standing on a circular pedestal surrounded by 3 fawning attendants. She was draped in layers of imported white silk and intricate French lace. Susan sat on a velvet sofa nearby, sipping champagne from a crystal flute and gazing at Madison as if she were a reigning monarch. As soon as my sensible leather loafers clicked against the hardwood floor, Madison caught my reflection in the massive trifold mirror. Her perfect smile instantly dropped into a scowl. She waved her hand at the lead attendant with a dismissive flutter of her fingers. "Bring out the special dress for my sister," Madison commanded, her voice loud enough to ensure the other wealthy clients in the boutique turned to look. "The one we had to scramble to find this morning." The attendant gave me a tight, professionally polite smile and carried over a garment bag. When she unzipped it, I had to stop myself from laughing out loud. It was a hideous neon chartreuse monstrosity. The fabric was stiff, cheap polyester that looked highly flammable. It had an oversized, ruffled neckline and was visibly tailored for someone at least 2 sizes larger than me. It was the physical embodiment of an insult. Madison spun around on her pedestal, her eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. Since you made it abundantly clear last night that you are completely broke and refusing to help the family with the catering deposit, I had to completely alter my vision for the bridal party. I found this on a clearance rack at a discount outlet downtown. I know designer prices scare you on your little student budget, so I did you a massive favor. It was only $60. Susan took another sip of her champagne and nodded in agreement. You should be thanking your sister Paige. She is compromising the aesthetic of her perfect day to accommodate your ongoing financial failures. The least you can do is put it on and try not to look so miserable, although that color will do absolutely nothing for your complexion. The boutique attendants exchanged uncomfortable, judgmental glances. They looked at my understated clothes, absorbing Madison's loud broadcast of my supposed poverty. They were judging me exactly the way my family intended. Madison smoothed the delicate lace on her own bodice and sighed with exaggerated contentment. She turned her attention back to the lead attendant, raising her voice to ensure her bragging carried across the entire salon. DeAndre told me to spare absolutely no expense, Madison boasted, admiring her reflection. He said a Wall Street vice president needs his wife looking like $1 million. This custom silk alone is $50,000, and he did not even blink when I told him the price. He is wiring the funds directly from his executive account this morning. It is just so liberating to marry a man who actually generates real wealth. She looked directly at me through the mirror, her eyes narrowing with spite. Unlike some people who spend their 30s hiding in a university library relying on handouts, you really should have taken that receptionist job DeAndre sent you last night, Paige. Maybe if you worked a real job, you could have afforded a decent haircut for my wedding photos. The arrogance radiating from her was suffocating. She had tied her entire self-worth, her entire identity, to a man who was actively funding her fantasy with stolen money. She was standing in a $50,000 dress paid for by an elaborate Ponzi scheme that had just drained our father's retirement account dry. And she was using that stolen illusion to mock me. I looked down at the cheap neon polyester dress in my hands. The irony of the situation was absolutely staggering. I literally owned the debt that was currently tearing DeAndre's world apart. I gave Madison a polite, completely unbothered smile. You are right, Madison. It is definitely a unique color. Let me go try it on. I took the hideous garment and walked into the massive mirror-lined fitting room. The attendant pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, leaving me in total privacy. I did not even bother unzipping the dress. I tossed the chartreuse nightmare onto a velvet chair in the corner and pulled my phone from my pocket. I did not have to wait long. Almost immediately, a secure, high-priority notification popped up on my screen from Marcus. The message was short, precise, and carried the weight of a financial execution. DeAndre just attempted to process the $50,000 payment to El Atelier Bridal using his Vanguard corporate card. The transaction was instantly declined due to insufficient funds. The hard lock placed by our acquisition team is officially active. I stared at the glowing text message from my lead analyst. The $50,000 transaction for Madison's custom silk gown had just been declined. My hostile audit was tearing through DeAndre's financial safety nets faster than I had anticipated. I locked my phone screen, not even bothering to step back into the chartreuse bridesmaid dress. I simply draped the cheap neon polyester over my arm, pushed open the heavy oak door of the velvet-lined fitting room, and walked back onto the main floor of the boutique. The atmosphere in the salon had completely shattered. The fawning, hushed silence of the high-end retail space was gone, replaced by a tense, vibrating panic. Madison was still standing on her circular pedestal, but she was no longer admiring her reflection. She was clutching her phone, her knuckles stark white, demanding immediate answers from the boutique's manager. Susan was sitting on the edge of the velvet sofa, frantically fanning herself with a bridal magazine, looking around as if a crime had just been committed in her presence. Before the manager could offer another polite platitude about processing errors and banking limits, the heavy glass front doors of the boutique flew open. DeAndre rushed inside, nearly knocking over a display of crystal tiaras. He did not look like the untouchable Wall Street titan from the Michelin-starred restaurant last night. His tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned, his silk tie was loosened, and a highly visible sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He was breathing heavily, practically sprinting toward Madison, waving his hands in a practiced, placating gesture. He loudly announced to the entire salon that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. He claimed his bank had initiated a sudden overzealous security freeze on his corporate account. According to DeAndre, a $50,000 bridal boutique charge had simply triggered their fraud prevention algorithms because it was outside his usual spending pattern. He smoothly blamed the bank's automated systems, deploying financial jargon to confuse the room. He assured Madison and the highly skeptical boutique staff that a wire transfer would clear by the end of the business day, apologizing for the minor, laughable inconvenience. Susan immediately let out a dramatic sigh of relief, praising DeAndre for being so responsible with his banking security. Madison visibly relaxed her smug superiority, instantly returning, as she shot a withering look at the boutique manager, forever doubting her fiancé. But DeAndre was still sweating. His eyes darted nervously around the room until they landed on me standing quietly by the fitting rooms with the ugly dress draped over my arm. His false bravado slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by pure, unfiltered venom. He excused himself from his bride and marched directly over to me. He grabbed my elbow with a tight grip and pulled me sharply behind a display of imported lace veils, completely out of earshot of my mother and sister. He backed me against the frosted glass wall, leaning in close. His breath smelled of stale coffee and pure, unadulterated panic. He jabbed a finger in my direction, aggressively warning me to stay far away from his in-laws and their money. He accused me of hovering around the family like a vulture waiting for a handout. He told me that just because my father had cut me off did not mean I could start leeching off Madison's success. He demanded I leave the boutique immediately, insisting that my very presence was a toxic embarrassment that was ruining the aesthetic of his perfect life. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just looked at him. Really looked at him. When you manage risk analysis algorithms for global hedge funds, you learn to spot the smallest discrepancies in data sets. You learn that people who shout the loudest are usually the ones hiding the most. DeAndre was a walking, talking discrepancy. He was projecting extreme untouchable wealth, but his foundational details were entirely wrong. My eyes dropped to the hand he had slammed against the glass wall beside my head. He was wearing the same flashy, oversized Rolex Submariner he had practically shoved in my face at dinner the night before. He claimed it was a custom import, a symbol of his market dominance. But up close under the harsh, bright halogen lights of the bridal display, the flaws were glaringly obvious. A genuine Rolex movement is mechanical and completely fluid. The second hand glides across the dial in a continuous, smooth sweep. The second hand on DeAndre's watch was ticking. It was a jerky staccato jump from second to second. It was powered by a cheap quartz battery. Furthermore, the Cyclops lens over the date window was entirely flat, completely lacking the mandatory magnification of an authentic piece. The bezel alignment was slightly off-center, and the weight of the metal looked suspiciously light. The man was actively drowning in millions of dollars of client debt, and he was trying to physically intimidate me while wearing a cheap replica purchased from a folding table on Canal Street. I let my gaze slowly travel from his ticking fake watch back up to his panicked, sweating face. I did not raise my voice. I leaned in, closing the remaining distance between us, ensuring my words were barely more than a whisper. I told him that I found his aggressive financial advice incredibly fascinating. I asked him if his Vanguard portfolio was returning such incredible record-breaking profits. Why was he threatening me while wearing a Canal Street replica? I watched his jaw slacken, but I did not stop there. I kept my tone perfectly level, devoid of any emotion, and delivered the final devastating blow. I asked him why, if he was truly a Wall Street genius, his corporate card had just violently bounced trying to pay for his fiancée's gown. DeAndre's face went completely ghost white. The aggressive posture drained from his body in an instant, leaving him staring at me in absolute paralyzed terror as he realized I knew exactly what he was hiding. The heavy oak doors of the Oakbrook Country Club dining room swung shut, sealing in the scent of roasted prime rib and expensive heavy perfumes. We were seated for the rehearsal dinner surrounded by 50 of Manhattan's supposed elite. My mother had spared no expense to transform the private banquet hall into a shrine dedicated to Madison and DeAndre's fabricated success. Massive floral centerpieces dominated the tables, and a live string quartet played softly from a raised dais in the corner. It was the perfect stage for a family that existed entirely on illusions. I was seated at a round table near the back, strategically placed near the kitchen swinging doors by my mother. It was a calculated insult, ensuring I was seated with distant cousins and plus ones, rather than at the head table. I did not mind. It gave me the perfect unobstructed vantage point to observe the head table. DeAndre looked physically ill. The arrogant, untouchable Wall Street titan from the Michelin-starred restaurant the night before had completely vanished. He was sweating profusely through his bespoke tuxedo shirt, constantly tugging at his collar, and downing his scotch with the frantic urgency of a man facing a firing squad. He kept casting terrified, darting glances in my direction. He knew that I knew. The cheap replica watch, the violently bounced corporate card, the collapsed fund, the walls were closing in on him rapidly, and he was completely trapped in a room full of people he was actively defrauding. Madison, utterly oblivious to her fiancé's impending implosion, was holding court. She practically vibrated with smug satisfaction, flashing her fraudulent diamond ring at anyone who walked past the head table. She was completely intoxicated by the attention and the perceived wealth that surrounded her. Susan was busy working the room, fawning over DeAndre's colleagues. She desperately tried to impress men who were likely junior brokers masquerading as senior partners, laughing too loudly at their jokes, and bragging about the Wilson family legacy. Then the sharp, authoritative clinking of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the low hum of conversation. Richard stood at the center of the head table holding a wireless microphone. The room quieted immediately. My father commanded attention, wearing his tailored tuxedo like a suit of armor. He looked out over the crowd with a wide, arrogant smile, completely blind to the fact that his entire life savings, his precious retirement fund, was currently propping up the scam of the sweating man seated to his left. He cleared his throat, his voice booming over the speakers. He welcomed the guests, specifically pandering to DeAndre's family and colleagues, thanking them for welcoming the Wilsons into their prestigious circle. He spoke about the importance of legacy, the absolute necessity of aggressive ambition, and what it meant to truly succeed in a ruthless financial world. "When I look at DeAndre," Richard proclaimed, placing a heavy hand on his future son-in-law's shoulder, "I see the son I always wanted. I see a Wall Street visionary. A man who understands that wealth is not handed to you, it is conquered. DeAndre is the savior of the Wilson family legacy, a man who has secured my daughter's future, and quite frankly elevated this entire family to a tier of success we always knew we deserved." DeAndre flinched under my father's heavy hand, his eyes widening in pure panic. He looked like he wanted to bolt for the emergency exit. Richard was not finished. He gripped the microphone tighter and turned his gaze directly toward my table at the back of the room. The warm, proud, fatherly tone vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. "It is important to have contrast in life to truly appreciate success," Richard announced, ensuring every single guest turned their head to follow his line of sight. "We celebrate Madison and DeAndre tonight, but we must also acknowledge the harsh realities of the world. Look at my other daughter, Paige." A heavy, uncomfortable silence blanketed the banquet hall. Distant cousins shifted awkwardly in their seats. Susan smiled approvingly from the head table. "Paige is a cautionary tale of wasted potential," Richard stated, his voice echoing brutally against the high ceilings. "She is 33 years old, entirely consumed by endless academic pursuits that produce absolutely nothing of value. She refused to understand how the real world operates. She refused to step up for this family when asked to cover a simple catering deposit, citing financial ruin. She sits here tonight as living proof that without the aggressive winning mindset of a man like DeAndre, you will amount to absolutely nothing." He was using my public humiliation as a prop to make DeAndre look taller. He was tearing down his own flesh and blood to impress a room full of strangers, desperate to validate the massive, reckless gamble he had taken with his retirement funds. I did not lower my head. I did not break eye contact with my father. I sat perfectly still, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I slowly reached out and curled my fingers around the stem of my champagne flute. At the head table, DeAndre was hyperventilating. His hands were shaking so violently that his heavy crystal water glass rattled against the table. Then the tense silence of the room was broken by a sharp, aggressive buzzing. It was DeAndre's phone resting face up on the mahogany table. It buzzed once, then twice, then a continuous, relentless vibration that demanded immediate attention. Several of DeAndre's colleagues in the crowd reached into their tuxedo pockets as their own phones began to chime with synchronized alerts. Richard paused his speech, frowning in annoyance at the interruption. DeAndre stared at his glowing screen as if it were a venomous snake. He visibly swallowed hard, his trembling hand reaching out to swipe open the notification. I knew exactly what that message said. My team at Apex Data Solutions had flawlessly executed my command. I watched DeAndre's eyes scan the text. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him a sickening ashen gray. His jaw dropped. The email was a high-priority emergency alert, sent directly from the regional manager of Vanguard Investments. It detailed a massive, unprecedented hostile takeover of his specific management portfolio. It confirmed that every single cent of his highly leveraged toxic corporate debt had just been aggressively acquired by a private financial data firm. The firm was Apex Data Solutions. DeAndre was no longer owned by the bank. He was entirely legally and financially owned by me. He slowly lifted his head, his terrified wide eyes searching the room until they locked onto mine at the back table. While Richard stood there, microphone in hand, waiting to finish his speech about my wasted potential, I leaned back in my chair. I looked directly into DeAndre's panicked eyes, and with a slow, deliberate motion, I raised my champagne glass in a silent, perfectly executed toast. The polite applause from the dining room broke the heavy silence. DeAndre stood frozen at the head table. His eyes remained locked on my raised champagne flute. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. Richard clapped him heavily on the back, completely oblivious to the fact that his future son-in-law was currently experiencing a total financial meltdown. DeAndre forced a sickly mechanical smile and reached for his water glass. His hands trembled so violently that ice water sloshed over the rim, soaking into the pristine white tablecloth. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the vintage bubbles dissolve on my tongue, and gently set the crystal flute back down on the table. Before DeAndre could pull out his phone or scramble for an exit, Susan stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her designer evening gown, adjusted her diamond necklace, and navigated through the maze of tables. She charted a direct course for my seat near the kitchen swinging doors. Her face was set in a tight, socially acceptable smile intended for the passing guests and the country club staff. Her eyes, however, were cold hard and focused entirely on me. She reached my table just as my distant cousin excused himself to grab a drink from the open bar, leaving us completely alone in the shadows of the banquet hall. Susan did not bother to pull out a chair. She reached into her sequined clutch and pulled out a folded piece of paper. With a sharp, dismissive flick of her wrist, she dropped it directly onto my dinner plate, right on top of my untouched slice of prime rib. It was a printed boarding pass. I glanced down at the stark black ink bleeding slightly against the ojus. It was a basic economy ticket for a red-eye flight back to Boston. The departure time was glaringly obvious. It was scheduled for 4 o'clock the following afternoon. That was exactly 1 hour after Madison and DeAndre were supposed to exchange their vows at the altar. I looked up at my mother. Susan leaned in close, the overwhelming scent of her expensive floral perfume masking the aroma of the roasted meat. Her voice dropped to a harsh, venomous whisper. She ordered me to pack my bags the moment I woke up tomorrow morning. She explicitly demanded that I attend the ceremony, sit silently in the very back pew, and immediately call a rideshare to the airport. The second the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. There would be no reception for me. There would be no celebratory dinner. There would be no dancing or toasts. Most importantly to Susan, I was absolutely forbidden from participating in the professional wedding photographs. She claimed my depressing presence, my cheap clothing, and my outright refusal to conform to their high society standards would permanently ruin the visual legacy of Madison's perfect day. I picked up my cloth napkin and wiped my fingers. I asked her why she even bothered inviting me if my mere presence was such a toxic, humiliating burden. Susan let out a sharp, derisive scoff, offended that I would even ask such a naive question. She admitted without a single ounce of hesitation that my invitation was nothing but a calculated public relations maneuver. She told me that Aunt Martha, Uncle Frank, and the rest of the judgmental extended family would ask too many uncomfortable questions if the sister of the bride was completely absent. She needed me there purely as a prop to maintain the illusion of a happy, unified, supportive family. Once the extended relatives saw me sitting in the pews, my purpose was entirely fulfilled. She wanted me discarded and out of sight before the $50,000 photographer started organizing the family portraits. Susan stood up straight, crossing her arms over her chest, waiting for me to break. She expected tears. She expected me to beg for a spot in the family photos, to plead for a chance to celebrate with my sister, or to throw a loud tantrum about the sheer disrespect of an economy ticket dropped into a plate of food. I did none of those things. I simply reached out and picked up the boarding pass. I smoothed out the crease where it had hit the meat, folded it neatly in half, and tucked it into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer. I looked back at her with a pleasant, completely unbothered expression and thanked her for handling my travel arrangements so efficiently. Susan frowned. My utter lack of emotional distress visibly unsettled her. It robbed her of the satisfaction she craved. She opened her mouth to deliver another cutting insult, but she was abruptly interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic vibration against the table. My phone resting next to my silverware had just lit up with a secure, high-priority notification. It was a direct encrypted message from Marcus at Apex Data Solutions. I kept my eyes fixed on my mother while my hand slid over the phone screen, unlocking it to read the incoming data alert. DeAndre had panicked. Cornered by the realization that my company had just acquired his highly leveraged, toxic debt, he had made a desperate, catastrophic attempt to cover his margins before the federal authorities or his firm's internal compliance officers could intervene. Marcus's message contained the raw, unedited transaction logs. DeAndre had just initiated an emergency, unauthorized wire transfer. He had liquidated Richard's entire Vanguard retirement account, the exact fund my father had spent his entire life building, and had blindly trusted his future son-in-law to manage. DeAndre had stolen the $1.5 million and wired it directly to the corporate entity holding his debt, desperately trying to pay it off and save himself from federal prison. The money had already cleared. The funds were fully secured. DeAndre had unknowingly taken my father's entire life savings and deposited it directly into my company's corporate accounts. I now legally possessed the entire Wilson family fortune. I locked my phone screen, slipped the device into my pocket alongside the cheap economy ticket, and gave my mother a bright, genuine smile. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the country club's master bridal suite, illuminating a scene of absolute unhinged panic. The scent of expensive hairspray and spilled mimosa soured the air, creating a cloying, suffocating atmosphere. I sat quietly in a wingback chair in the corner of the room, the chartreuse polyester dress draped over my lap, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. Madison was pacing the length of the Persian rug in a monogrammed silk robe. She was not glowing with bridal joy. She was vibrating with a shrill, terrifying rage. Her professional makeup artist stood frozen against the wall, clutching a blending sponge like a weapon, entirely too afraid to approach the bride. Evelyn, the high-end wedding planner, whose services cost more than my first car, stood by the vanity holding her silver iPad like a shield. Her professional, calming demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by the rigid posture of someone delivering terrible news. "I do not care what your little screen says, Evelyn," Madison shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a manicured finger at the planner. "You march down to the loading dock right now and tell the florist to start assembling the orchid archway. I have 500 guests arriving in exactly 4 hours. This is my wedding day." Evelyn adjusted her glasses, her tone flat and unyielding. "I cannot do that, Madison. The lead florist and the executive catering director are both refusing to unload their trucks." DeAndre's final wire transfers for the remaining balances were initiated yesterday afternoon, but they bounced hard at 6 o'clock this morning. The bank issued a hard decline. "The vendors are demanding immediate payment in full or they are driving away. They will not set up a single chair until the funds clear." Madison let out a guttural scream, grabbing a crystal perfume bottle from the vanity and hurling it into a nearby trash can. It shattered loudly against the metal bottom. She was not concerned about DeAndre. She did not express a single ounce of worry about her fiancé's well-being, or why his accounts were suddenly frozen. Her entire identity, her absolute sense of self-worth, was entirely tethered to the lavish display of wealth scheduled to happen downstairs. She had spent the last 2 years bragging to every socialite in Manhattan about the imported Wagyu beef, the hand-strung orchids, the custom ice sculptures, and the endless flow of vintage champagne. Those elements were not just party favors, they were her armor. Without them, she was nothing. The prospect of her wealthy friends arriving to an empty ballroom with no food and bare tables was actively triggering a severe psychological breakdown. She was hyperventilating, completely unable to process a reality where she was not the wealthiest woman in the room. Susan was frantically pacing behind the velvet sofa, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. She ended another call with an aggressive swipe of her thumb. "DeAndre is still going straight to voicemail." Susan snapped, her own panic rising to match her daughter's. "This is completely unacceptable. He assured us that security freeze was a minor glitch last night. He is making us look like fools in front of the club staff." I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the absolute destruction of their carefully curated illusion. The glitch was not a glitch. DeAndre was currently missing in action because he was likely barricaded in his hotel room, trying to figure out how to escape federal jurisdiction. He had drained his future father-in-law's retirement fund to save his own skin, and he had thrown my sister to the wolves to buy himself a few extra hours of freedom. "I am going to be a laughingstock," Madison sobbed, dropping onto the velvet sofa and burying her face in her hands. "The country club board members are coming. The managing partners from DeAndre's firm are coming. If those vendors leave, my life is completely over. I will never be able to show my face in this city again. Evelyn, you have to fix this." The heavy oak door of the bridal suite flew open. Richard stormed into the room, already dressed in his custom tuxedo. He looked agitated, but entirely confident, carrying the aura of a man accustomed to solving problems with a checkbook. He took one look at Madison's tear-streaked face and scowled deeply. "Stop crying immediately, Madison," Richard commanded, adjusting his silk cufflinks with a sharp snap. "You are going to ruin your complexion, and the photographer is costing me a fortune. What is the meaning of this hysteria?" Susan rushed over to him, her voice trembling with anxiety. "The vendors are threatening to leave, Richard. DeAndre's final wires did not clear this morning. The florist and the caterer want their balances paid right now in full, and DeAndre is not answering his phone. We are facing a complete disaster." Richard rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, patronizing sigh that echoed in the quiet suite. He puffed out his chest, stepping perfectly into the role of the wealthy patriarch swooping in to save the day from female hysteria. "Is that all?" he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand at Evelyn the planner. "DeAndre warned us about this last night. His bank is being overly cautious with his corporate card. It is a minor administrative delay typical for accounts of his magnitude. There is absolutely no reason for this panic." Richard reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He looked down at Madison, offering a magnanimous, prideful smile. "Dry your eyes, sweetie. You are marrying a Wall Street heavyweight, and you are a Wilson. We do not panic over clerical errors. I will simply transfer the remaining vendor balances directly from my executive emergency fund. DeAndre can reimburse me on Monday when the banks open." Evelyn cautiously stepped forward, offering the total outstanding balance. Richard did not even ask for the number. He confidently tapped the screen of his phone, logging into his secure Vanguard investment portal. He intended to initiate an immediate wire transfer to silence the vendors and preserve the family's immaculate image. I watched him from my corner. I watched the exact second his eyes registered the numbers on his digital dashboard. The arrogant, condescending smirk froze permanently on his face. The color drained from his cheeks with alarming speed, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His hand began to shake, the phone trembling violently in his grip. He swiped down on the screen, frantically refreshing the page. He refreshed it again. He closed the application and reopened it, his breathing turning ragged and shallow. The result was exactly the same. The $1.5 million account was completely gone. The silence in the bridal suite was suddenly deafening. Richard stared at the screen of his smartphone, his thumb hovering frozen over the Vanguard application. The bold black numbers mocked him. $0.00. His $1.5 million retirement fund, the bedrock of his entire arrogant existence, had been completely wiped clean. He blinked rapidly, his mind desperately rejecting the data. He looked up at Madison, who was still hysterically berating the wedding planner about the floral archway, and then at Susan, who was practically vibrating with upper-class anxiety. Richard's jaw tightened. His pride was a physical barrier preventing him from admitting to his wife and daughter that their financial safety net had just evaporated. He could not be the bearer of failure. He could not look weak. He shoved the phone deep into his tuxedo pocket, forcing a mask of stern patriarchal authority onto his ashen face. He promised Madison he would handle the catering dispute personally. He turned on his heel and marched out of the bridal suite, his heavy footsteps echoing down the carpeted hallway of the country club. I waited exactly 10 seconds before setting my coffee mug down on the vanity. I smoothed the wrinkles from my blazer and quietly followed him out the door. Richard did not head toward the loading dock to deal with the angry vendors. He made a direct, aggressive line for the groom's private dressing room at the end of the east wing. I shadowed him, my sensible flats making no sound against the thick carpeting. When he reached the heavy mahogany door, he did not knock. He threw it open with enough force to crack the wood against the doorstop and stormed inside, slamming it shut behind him. I caught the door just before the latch clicked, leaving a crack wide enough to hear and see everything perfectly. DeAndre was standing in the center of the room. He had not even put on his tuxedo jacket yet. He was pacing furiously, clutching his phone to his ear, barking desperate, hushed orders at an automated banking menu. When Richard burst in, DeAndre practically jumped out of his skin, fumbling his phone and nearly dropping it onto the hardwood floor. Richard crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He grabbed DeAndre by the lapels of his crisp white shirt, shoving him backward until the groom hit the edge of a leather billiard table. "Where is my money, DeAndre?" Richard demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I just logged into my executive portfolio to wire the final vendor payments. The account is entirely empty. $1.5 million. Gone. You told me those funds were locked in high-yield municipal bonds. Where is it?" DeAndre's eyes darted wildly toward the door, then back to his furious future father-in-law. For a split second, I saw the raw, unfiltered terror of a cornered animal. But then the survival instincts of a career con artist kicked in. DeAndre smoothed his expression, forced a condescending smile, and gently pried Richard's hands off his shirt. Richard, please," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with practiced soothing arrogance. "Take a breath. You are overreacting to standard compliance protocols. This is exactly why you hired me to manage your assets. You do not understand the microfluctuations of weekend institutional trading." Richard stepped back, his chest heaving, but the authoritative certainty in DeAndre's voice had already planted a seed of doubt. Richard's entire ego was built on the premise that he was a savvy, intelligent patriarch. DeAndre knew exactly how to exploit that. If Richard admitted he did not understand the market, he looked weak. DeAndre was banking entirely on the older man's pride to keep him from asking too many detailed questions. "It is a standard SEC regulation, 15C3-3 liquidity sweep." DeAndre lied smoothly, throwing out random financial terminology with absolute conviction. "The Securities and Exchange Commission initiated a routine weekend hold on our overarching firm accounts to recalibrate the margin requirements for the upcoming quarter. Your funds were simply migrated into a temporary third-party escrow ledger to protect your high-yield status during the audit. It is a protective measure, Richard. It shows zero on the user end, but the capital is fully secured in the back-end ledger." I watched my father's face through the crack in the door. The aggressive fury was slowly draining away, replaced by hesitant relief. He wanted to believe DeAndre. He needed to believe DeAndre. The alternative was that he had handed his entire life savings to a fraud, and Richard's pride simply could not process that level of personal failure. "A liquidity sweep," Richard repeated, testing the phrase, nodding slowly, as if he completely understood the fabricated concept. "So the money is safe. It is just temporarily inaccessible." "Absolutely," DeAndre smiled, adjusting his cufflinks. "It will reflect in your primary dashboard by Monday morning. As for the vendors downstairs, my bank is still clearing the security freeze on my corporate card. If you could just front the cash for the florist right now, I will reimburse you with a premium dividend on Monday." "I cannot front the cash, DeAndre," Richard snapped, his panic returning briefly. "My liquid assets were in that Vanguard account." I pushed the mahogany door open. The heavy hinges groaned slightly, drawing both of their heads toward me. I stepped into the room, letting the door click firmly shut behind me. He cannot front the cash, DeAndre. I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion, because you drained his only liquid account at exactly 3:14 this morning. Paige! Richard barked, his face flushing with immediate defensive anger. Get out of here. This is a private financial discussion. You have absolutely no business. SEC Regulation 15C3-3 is the customer protection rule, I stated, completely ignoring my father and locking my eyes onto DeAndre. It requires broker-dealers to isolate client funds in secure accounts completely separate from the firm's operating capital. It is designed to prevent brokers from using client money to cover their own toxic margins. DeAndre's fake smile vanished. He took a slow step backward, bumping against the billiard table again. I walked further into the room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Furthermore, I continued translating DeAndre's frantic jargon into brutal plain English. A margin recalibration does not result in a total asset liquidation into an unverified third-party escrow account, and it certainly does not zero out a retail Vanguard portfolio at 3 in the morning on a Saturday. Richard looked between the two of us, his confident posture finally breaking. Paige, what are you talking about? DeAndre just explained the hold. He lied to you, Dad, I said, turning to look at my father with a gaze completely devoid of pity. He did not invest your money. He was drowning in toxic corporate debt. His firm was days away from total collapse. When his creditors finally called in his margins yesterday, he panicked. He accessed your executive portfolio, liquidated the entire $1.5 million, and wired it out to save himself. You are out of your mind, DeAndre spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. Richard, do not listen to this jealous, bitter woman. She does not know what she is talking about. I calmly raised my left wrist and looked down at my watch. The second hand swept smoothly across the dial. The SEC doesn't freeze accounts on weekends, DeAndre, I said, looking back up at him with a chilling, victorious smile. But acquiring companies do. The silence that followed my words was absolute and suffocating. DeAndre stood frozen against the billiard table, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, unable to formulate a single syllable of defense. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between my calm, unyielding expression and DeAndre's terrified, guilty face. The arrogant patriarch of the Wilson family was visibly breaking apart. The realization that he had just handed his entire life savings, his entire identity to a desperate fraud, was short-circuiting his brain. Before Richard could lunge across the room and wrap his hands around DeAndre's throat, the heavy mahogany door swung open again. Susan burst into the room. She was practically vibrating with a terrifying manic energy. Her eyes were wide, and her perfectly styled hair trembled as she moved. She did not notice the thick, venomous tension in the air. She did not look at the empty screen of Richard's phone or register the absolute horror painted across her future son-in-law's face. "What is taking so long?" Susan hissed, her voice a sharp, frantic whisper. "The string quartet has been playing the prelude loop for 15 minutes. The country club board is seated in the front row. The governor's chief of staff just arrived. Richard, you need to be at the vestibule right now. Madison is having a total meltdown because her mascara is running." Richard slowly turned his head to look at his wife. His voice was a hollow, scraped-out rasp. "Susan, the money. It is gone. My entire retirement account. DeAndre took it." Susan stopped dead in her tracks. She looked at Richard, then at DeAndre, and finally at me. For a fraction of a second, the pristine facade cracked, revealing the raw, unadulterated panic beneath. But Susan was a creature entirely built of social preservation. The threat of financial ruin was terrifying, but the threat of public humiliation in front of 300 elite guests was apocalyptic. She simply could not process a reality where this wedding did not happen. Her entire social standing, her identity among her wealthy peers, hinged on this lavish display of perfection. She took a sharp, jagged breath, straightening her spine and lifting her chin. She marched over to Richard and grabbed his arm with a bruising, white-knuckled grip. "I do not care," Susan commanded, her voice dropping to a terrifying, robotic monotone. "I do not care if the banks are burning to the ground. I do not care if every single account is completely empty. We have 300 guests sitting in that ballroom. You will walk out of this room, you will take your daughter's arm, you will walk her down that aisle, and you will smile. We will deal with this disaster tomorrow. Today we are putting on a wedding." She shot a venomous glare at DeAndre. And you will stand at that altar and act like the man we thought you were. Move. Richard looked like a reanimated corpse, but decades of conditioning to protect the family image kicked in. He let Susan physically pull him toward the door. DeAndre followed his steps unsteady, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. I watched them go, admiring the sheer psychotic determination of my mother's denial. They were drowning, yet they insisted on pretending to swim. I exited the suite a moment later and made my way toward the grand ballroom. The venue was undeniably spectacular. Cascading arrangements of white orchids and imported roses draped over every surface. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over the gathered elite of the city. Waiters stood at attention, completely unaware that the checks meant to pay their wages had just bounced into oblivion. I bypassed the velvet-roped VIP sections. I walked past the mahogany chairs marked with silk ribbons for the extended family, the corporate partners, and the country club executives. I kept walking until I reached the very last row of the ballroom. I found my assigned seat. Row 40, Seat D. It was positioned practically inside the shadow of the rear exit doors, positioned directly next to a drafted serving station where the busboys cleared empty glasses. Susan had handed me this seating card 3 months ago with a chillingly sweet, condescending smile. She had explained that the front rows were strictly reserved for immediate family and important financial stakeholders. She claimed it was a matter of visual symmetry for the photographer. The reality was brutally clear. The sister of the bride did not qualify as immediate family if her bank account, her career, and her refusal to play the social game embarrassed the matriarch. She had intentionally placed me in the darkest, least visible corner of the room, hoping I would blend into the wallpaper and disappear. I sat down, smoothing the skirt of my practical dress. It gave me the absolute perfect vantage point for the entire room. The heavy brass doors at the front of the hall swung open. The string quartet immediately shifted from the soft prelude to the soaring, dramatic notes of the bridal chorus. The guests rose to their feet in a synchronized wave. Madison appeared at the top of the aisle. She looked like a porcelain doll sculpted from spun sugar and French lace. The dress was a masterpiece of couture design, trailing a cathedral-length veil behind her. But as she began her slow march down the white runner, the illusion fractured. Her grip on Richard's arm was so tight, her knuckles were stark white. Richard stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, entirely drained of his usual arrogant swagger. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. Madison's smile was a terrifying, fixed grimace. She clearly knew about the florist and catering disaster upstairs, though she likely did not know the full extent of her father's total financial ruin yet. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, desperate to validate her worth through the envious stares of the audience. She relied entirely on this lavish display to feel important, and every step she took was built on a foundation of stolen money and federal fraud. They reached the altar. DeAndre waited, looking physically ill. His skin was slick with cold sweat. He reached out to take Madison's hand, and I could see his fingers trembling violently even from 40 rows back. Susan sat in the front pew, her posture rigidly perfect, her eyes darting aggressively around the room to ensure no one suspected the catastrophic truth. The officiant, a prominent local bishop hired for his prestige, stepped forward to the podium. He raised his hands, his booming theatrical voice, asking the congregation to quiet down and celebrate this majestic union of two prominent legacy families. He began to speak of trust, building a foundation for the future, and unwavering honesty. The sheer irony of his words echoed beautifully in the cavernous, flower-filled room. I looked down at my watch. The second hand ticked precisely to the hour. Right on schedule. The heavy brass handles of the venue's rear doors pressed open with a soft, synchronized click. A rush of cool, sharp air cut through the stifling mixture of expensive perfume and body heat filling the crowded ballroom. I did not need to turn my head to know who had just entered. I heard the muffled, authoritative footsteps against the carpet. A team of men and women in sharp, dark suits filed silently into the back row, forming a solid wall directly behind my chair. Marcus stood at the center, clutching a tablet displaying the locked, frozen routing numbers. He was flanked by two federal agents clutching leather briefcases filled with warrants and my lead corporate litigator. The trap was shut. Marcus stepped close to my shoulder, his breathing steady and controlled. I felt the slight brush of a federal warrant against my sleeve as one of the agents shifted his weight. I raised a single finger, signaling them to hold their position. The trap was completely shut, but the performance at the altar had not yet reached its crescendo. I wanted to watch the illusion stretch to its absolute breaking point. The bishop continued his sermon, his booming theatrical voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. He praised the virtues of honesty, financial partnership, and building a foundation on unwavering truth. The irony was so thick, it was practically choking the air out of the room. Up at the altar, DeAndre looked as though he might collapse directly onto the pristine white runner. His skin was slick with cold sweat, catching the harsh glare of the venue lighting. His eyes darted frantically toward the emergency exit signs illuminating the side doors, but he was pinned in place by the sheer weight of 300 expectant, wealthy stares. Madison stood beside him, clutching his hands so tightly her knuckles were entirely bloodless. She was anchoring him to the spot through pure, terrified willpower, completely determined to force this wedding into existence, regardless of the financial apocalypse happening behind the scenes. The bishop paused. He took a deep, dramatic breath, signaling the traditional turning point of the ceremony. He looked out over the sea of designer suits, expensive fascinators, and glittering diamonds. He asked the congregation if anyone present knew of any reason why this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, instructing them to speak now or forever hold their peace. It was a purely ceremonial question. No one actually objects at a high society country club wedding. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds, filled only by the soft rustle of silk and the quiet hum of the venue's ventilation system. I braced my hands against the arms of my chair, preparing to stand and end the charade. Before I could move a single muscle, Richard bolted up from the front pew. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Susan let out a sharp, strangled noise, grabbing desperately at the hem of his tuxedo jacket in a frantic attempt to pull him back down to his seat. Richard completely ignored her. He yanked his jacket free, stepped directly out of the aisle, and bypassed the bewildered bishop entirely. He climbed the 3 steps to the altar and turned his back on his trembling daughter and her terrified groom. Richard commandeered the entire venue, planting his feet firmly and addressing the vast audience. His chest was puffed out, his chin held high, projecting the absolute pinnacle of patriarchal authority and limitless wealth. He announced, his voice booming without the need for a microphone, that he was not standing to object. He claimed he was standing to add to the sheer magnitude of this historic family union. Richard launched into a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated speech about family loyalty, enduring legacy, and his immense, profound pride in the man Madison had chosen to marry. He spoke at length about providing a solid foundation for the future generation. He meticulously projected his voice so his words carried directly to the front rows, where the country club board members, his corporate rivals, and the governor's chief of staff were seated. It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation and supreme denial. Richard knew his accounts were completely empty. He knew DeAndre had liquidated his life savings just hours prior. But instead of confronting reality, he chose to double down on the illusion. His entire identity was inextricably tied to his status as an untouchable titan of industry. If he admitted he had been conned by his own future son-in-law, his reputation would be permanently destroyed. He was using this fake grand gesture to blindside DeAndre, relying on the sheer public pressure of a massive audience to force the younger man into staying loyal and keeping the devastating secret buried. Richard reached into the inner breast pocket of his custom tuxedo and retrieved a heavy black velvet box. He snapped it open with a loud click, revealing an ornate antique brass key resting on a bed of white satin. He declared to the room that he was gifting the newlyweds the family's $12 million Aspen estate as a wedding present. He turned and shoved the box directly into DeAndre's shaking hands. Richard loudly commanded the groom to use this generational wealth to build an unbreakable empire for Madison. He clapped DeAndre on the shoulder, digging his fingers painfully into the fabric of the groom's suit, locking him into the lie. It was the ultimate psychological trap. Richard was forcing DeAndre to play along, cementing his own image as the ultimate benevolent provider while privately bleeding out. DeAndre stared down at the velvet box, as if it contained a live explosive. The crowd erupted into polite, restrained applause. Wealthy guests murmured in awe at the sheer magnitude of the patriarch's generosity, nodding in approval at the staggering display of capital. The bishop smiled, stepping back up to the podium, ready to resume the vows and finalize the union. I stood up. I stepped out from the heavy shadows of row 40, walking straight past the solid wall of federal agents, waiting silently behind my chair. I did not shout, but the immaculate acoustics of the grand ballroom carried my calm, unwavering voice perfectly down the center aisle. "I am sorry, Richard." I said my words, slicing through the lingering applause like a physical blade. "You cannot gift a house you do not own." The entire venue went dead silent. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and deeply suffocating. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that immediately precedes a catastrophic storm. 300 heads snapped toward the back of the room in perfect unison. The collective intake of breath from the city's elite sounded like a vacuum, instantly pulling all the oxygen from the space. Up at the altar, Richard's chest stopped heaving. His face transitioned from a pale, sickly gray to an explosive, furious crimson. The polished, benevolent facade of the wealthy patriarch completely dissolved, replaced entirely by raw, unhinged panic. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium, his knuckles turning stark white against the dark wood. "Sit down immediately," Richard roared, his voice cracking with unchecked, desperate rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me across the vast expanse of the room. "Security, remove her from this venue. She is deeply unwell. She is trying to ruin her sister's perfect day out of pure spiteful jealousy. Get her out of here right now." I did not sit down. I stepped fully out from the shadows of row 40 and positioned myself directly in the center of the pristine white aisle runner. The thick fabric crunched softly beneath my sensible flats. I began to walk forward. I did not rush my pace. My steps were deliberate, measured, and completely unbothered by the hundreds of glaring eyes fixed intensely upon me. As I moved past the back rows, the whispers began. They hissed through the crowd like dry leaves catching fire. I walked past the country club board members who were shifting uncomfortably in their mahogany chairs. I passed the managing partners of DeAndre's soon-to-be defunct firm, their eyes darting nervously toward the federal agent standing at the rear exits. I passed Aunt Martha and Uncle Frank, whose jaws were practically resting on their laps in sheer, unadulterated shock. Susan sat completely frozen in the front pew. The color had entirely drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her expensive foundation now looked like a clay mask. She stared at me as if I were a ghost rising directly from the floorboards. Madison was trembling so violently that the delicate white orchids in her bridal bouquet were shedding petals onto the marble floor. She looked pleadingly at her father, then at DeAndre, desperately waiting for anyone to restore the illusion of their limitless wealth and save her from this public nightmare. I reached the midpoint of the long aisle and raised my right hand, giving a sharp, subtle flick of my index finger. My lead corporate litigator, David, instantly detached himself from the wall of federal agents at the back of the room. He moved forward with predatory grace, matching my stride and falling seamlessly into step beside me. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase. The metallic click of his shoes echoed loudly against the marble as we approached the altar steps together. The bishop, sensing the undeniable weight of legal authority bearing down on his ceremony, slowly backed away from the podium, clutching his ceremonial text to his chest. I ascended the 3 velvet-lined stairs and stood directly facing my father. He towered over me physically, but his posture was completely broken. His shoulders were slumped and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. His eyes darted frantically toward David, registering the sharp, undeniable reality of a high-powered attorney standing in his daughter's wedding. David did not say a single word. He snapped the latches of his briefcase open. He reached inside and extracted a thick, legally bound document bearing the prominent embossed seal of the state of Colorado. With a swift, practiced, and deeply aggressive motion, he slapped the heavy stack of paper directly onto the marble altar. The sound cracked through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. I looked Richard dead in the eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting it just enough to reach the first 3 rows, the rows occupied by the most influential, wealthy, and gossipy socialites in the city. You remortgaged the Aspen estate 3 years ago, Richard. I stated calmly, systematically, stripping away the last remaining shreds of his carefully curated dignity. You leveraged a generational family asset to the absolute maximum because your executive salary could no longer cover your country club dues, your leased luxury vehicles, and the exorbitant daily cost of maintaining this fake high society lifestyle. Richard opened his mouth to shout to issue another booming denial, but no words came out. The unvarnished truth had effectively paralyzed his vocal cords. You took out a massive secondary loan against that property just to pay the deposits for this absurd wedding. I continued gesturing broadly to the cascading floral arrangements, the custom ice sculptures, and the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. And when the adjustable rates skyrocketed last year, you immediately defaulted. You missed 6 consecutive payments. The bank did not care about your last name or your local legacy. They foreclosed on the property exactly 1 month ago. You have been hiding the final notices in your home office safe, completely terrified that Susan would find out you are totally broke. From the front pew, Susan let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She clutched the fabric of her designer gown, her eyes wide with sheer terror. She stared at her husband silently, begging for a denial, but Richard could not even look at her. He stared down at the marble floor, completely defeated. DeAndre was still standing frozen at the altar. He was staring down at the black velvet box in his hands, as if it were coated in radioactive acid. The ornate brass key rested uselessly on the pristine white satin. I shifted my gaze from my ruined father to the terrified groom, and finally to my sister. Madison was now openly sobbing, her heavy makeup running in dark streaks down her face, her perfect day collapsing into absolute dust. I bought it out of foreclosure, I announced, making sure my voice was crystal clear, resonating perfectly so the front rows caught every single syllable of my victory. The title officially transferred to Apex Data Solutions yesterday afternoon. The locks were changed at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. That key in your hand is useless. The heavy silence in the ballroom shattered the moment Madison let out a shrill, piercing shriek. She threw the useless antique key onto the marble altar. The heavy brass clattered loudly, spinning in a tight circle before rolling to a stop against the polished toe of the bishop's leather shoe. Madison spun toward DeAndre, her tear-streaked face contorted into a mask of furious, unadulterated entitlement. She grabbed him by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, shaking him with surprising violent force for someone so delicate. "Do something, DeAndre," she screamed, her voice echoing harshly off the vaulted hand-painted ceilings. "You run a multi-million-dollar firm. You have Wall Street power. Call your lawyers, call the police, and have this psycho thrown out of my wedding right now." DeAndre did not look like a titan of finance wielding unlimited Wall Street power. He looked like a man standing squarely on the trapdoor of a gallows. Sweat poured down his forehead in thick droplets, soaking into the pristine white collar of his shirt. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically against his silk bow tie. He looked at the sea of wealthy guests, then at Richard, and finally at the solid wall of federal agents standing stoically at the back of the room. He realized the exits were sealed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had absolutely nowhere to run. The survival instinct of a career con artist is a terrifying, mesmerizing thing to witness. DeAndre forcefully pried Madison's hands off his lapels. He straightened his jacket, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and turned to face me. He manufactured a look of deep, sorrowful indignation, a perfect mask of offended dignity. "This is an absolute disgrace," DeAndre announced, projecting his rich baritone voice so it carried to the very last row of the cavernous room. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "I am going to bury you in defamation lawsuits, Paige. I will sue you for slander, libel, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I have an army of corporate litigators on retainer. You will spend the rest of your miserable life paying for this public stunt." I did not blink. I simply tilted my head, waiting for the rest of his desperate performance. DeAndre took a step forward, turning his body to address the crowd instead of me. He was playing directly to the wealthy liberal guilt of the country club elite sitting in the front rows. "Look at her," he scoffed, his voice dripping with rehearsed theatrical disgust. "This is nothing but the pathetic jealousy of a failed student. She could not handle the pressure of her own academic career. She dropped out of her master's program because she lacked the drive and the fundamental intellect to succeed. And now she is trying to destroy her sister's happiness because she cannot stand the fact that Madison chose a winner. He placed a hand over his heart, shaking his head mournfully. I came from nothing. I fought tooth and nail for every single dollar, every single ounce of respect I earned on Wall Street. I am a successful self-made black man who built an empire from the ground up, and Paige simply cannot stomach it. She hates that a man of my background is stepping into her precious privileged family and providing Madison with a life she could never achieve herself. This entire spectacle is just a desperate racist attempt to tear down a black man who dared to sit at their table and demand a seat at the head. A low, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the audience. A few of the influential board members shifted uneasily in their mahogany chairs, exchanging nervous glances. DeAndre had struck a massive cultural nerve. He was weaponizing the exact social dynamics my parents had worshipped and feared for decades. If he could frame me as a jealous, bigoted failure, he might just buy himself enough time to slip out the side doors while the crowd debated the morality of my interruption. Richard immediately seized the lifeline DeAndre threw him. She has always been deeply disturbed, Richard shouted, his face still flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. She has spent her entire life resenting Madison's grace and beauty. She is a sick, bitter woman. Do not listen to a single word she says. Security, I demand you remove her immediately. I let the murmurs build. I let the tension in the room stretch until it was nearly snapping. I let DeAndre stand there, chest puffed out, breathing heavily, entirely convinced he had just successfully manipulated the room and saved his own skin. I looked over my shoulder and gave David a single brief nod. David unzipped the secondary compartment of his leather briefcase. He pulled out a crisp, single sheet of printed paper. He handed it to me. The paper felt heavy in my hand, loaded with the absolute, undeniable destruction of the man standing on the altar. I walked up the remaining steps. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from DeAndre. He tried to maintain his posture of righteous indignation, but I could see the raw, unfiltered terror vibrating deep in his pupils. Up close, the illusion was completely gone. He smelled of expensive cologne and sour animal panic. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The venue was so incredibly quiet that my calm, conversational tone carried effortlessly across the marble flooring. Your performance is genuinely impressive, DeAndre, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion or pity. It is a beautiful, compelling narrative about a self-made man fighting against a jealous, privileged system. It is a fantastic script. You almost had them convinced, but the numbers do not care about your script. I held out the printed sheet of paper. DeAndre stared at it, refusing to lift his hands to take it. I stepped closer and pressed the paper flat against his chest, forcing him to grab it or let it fall to the floor in front of his new bride. He grabbed it automatically, his fingers crushing the edges of the thick parchment. Check your inbox, DeAndre, I said, locking my eyes onto his. Vanguard didn't just fire you this morning, they were liquidated, and my company Apex Data Solutions bought your debt. You owe me $4.2 million. The paper trembled in DeAndre's hands. His eyes darted back and forth across the printed text, scanning the stark black and white proof of his total financial annihilation. The arrogance that had defined his posture only seconds ago evaporated, leaving behind the hollow shell of a ruined man. Richard stared at me. The cogs in his mind were turning with agonizing slowness as he processed the words I had just spoken. Apex Data Solutions. The company that just bought the Aspen estate. The company that now owned DeAndre's toxic debt. The company that I, his supposedly disgraced dropout daughter, was standing in front of as a representative. You, Richard breathed the single syllable, scraping against the absolute silence of the ballroom. You are Apex Data Solutions. I founded it 5 years ago, I replied, my voice carrying the steady cadence of a boardroom executive closing a hostile takeover. While you and Susan were telling your country club friends that I was wandering aimlessly abroad, I was building a financial technology firm from a rented studio apartment. We specialize in acquiring and restructuring toxic institutional debt. Debt exactly like the worthless margin accounts your future son-in-law was using to fund his leased sports cars and fake hedge fund. The realization hit Richard with the force of a freight train. The daughter he had spent a decade mocking, the woman he had banished to the darkest corner of the venue, because she did not fit his pristine aesthetic was a fintech CEO. But the shock of my success was instantly eclipsed by a much darker, far more terrifying realization. If DeAndre was a fraud and DeAndre's firm had been liquidated, that meant the Vanguard account was not locked in a temporary SEC compliance sweep. My money, Richard growled. The sound was guttural, raw, and completely unhinged. He turned slowly toward the groom. DeAndre took a frantic step backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the marble altar. He bumped into Madison, who let out a sharp cry of alarm, dropping her cascading bouquet of white orchids. The flowers scattered across the floor trampled underfoot as Richard lunged. The patriarch of the family did not demand answers. He did not maintain the dignified composure of a legacy wealth executive. He threw his hands forward and grabbed DeAndre by the crisp white collar of his custom tuxedo shirt. Richard hoisted the younger man upward, nearly lifting him off his feet, his face twisted into a mask of pure, violent panic. "Where is my $1.5 million?" Richard screamed, spit flying from his lips and hitting DeAndre's cheek. "You told me it was a liquidity sweep. You looked me in the eye in that dressing room and swore the Vanguard funds were in a secure escrow ledger. Where is my retirement fund, you lying parasite?" DeAndre clawed desperately at Richard's massive hands, his face turning a blotchy, mottled purple as the tight collar restricted his airway. He choked out unintelligible syllables, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Below the altar, the illusion of the perfect family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Susan, the grand architect of this societal masterpiece, began to hyperventilate. Her hands flew to her chest, her perfectly manicured nails clawing at the neckline of her silk gown. She collapsed backward into the mahogany pew, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow gasps. She looked wildly at the front rows, the very people she had spent decades trying to impress. The country club elite, the corporate partners, and the governor's chief of staff were no longer a passive, polite audience. The polite veneer of high society vanished in an instant, replaced by the ravenous appetite of a crowd witnessing a spectacular, historic downfall. No one looked away. No one rushed forward to intervene. Instead, the soft glow of smartphone screens illuminated the dim ballroom. Women in expensive fascinators and men in tailored suits raised their devices, hitting record. They captured every second of Richard screaming, DeAndre choking, and Madison weeping hysterically at the altar. Tomorrow, this footage would be the main topic of conversation at every exclusive brunch and boardroom meeting in the state. Susan's social standing was not just damaged, it was actively burning to the ground on camera. "Please!" DeAndre wheezed, his voice a pathetic squeak as Richard shook him violently. "Richard, stop! You do not understand. I can fix this. I can move the capital." "You have no capital!" Richard roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He shoved DeAndre backward. The groom stumbled, his arms flailing, and crashed heavily against the wooden podium. The bishop's ceremonial text clattered to the floor, joining the crushed orchids. DeAndre scrambled to regain his footing, leaning heavily against the podium. He was completely cornered. His firm was gone. His reputation was destroyed. He was facing physical violence from a furious father-in-law and the terrifying prospect of federal fraud charges. His eyes darted around the room, finally locking onto me. A desperate, cornered animal instinct took over. If he was going down, he was going to deflect the blame. He raised a shaking, accusatory finger, pointing it directly at my chest. "Do not look at me," DeAndre shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Look at her. She is the one who took it, Richard. She orchestrated this entire thing to ruin us. She has your money. She took it." The entire ballroom collectively held its breath. Hundreds of glowing smartphone lenses pivoted slightly, refocusing directly on me. Richard turned slowly, his chest heaving, his eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of desperate hope and profound confusion. He wanted to believe DeAndre. He desperately wanted to believe that his money was sitting safely in my company's accounts, waiting to be returned to its rightful owner. I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch under the weight of their stares. I let a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. "You wired his entire retirement portfolio to my firm at 3:14 this morning," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable clarity. "You transferred $1.5 million directly into an Apex Data Solutions corporate account, but you did not do it as an investment, DeAndre." I took one step closer to the altar, making sure my next words were captured perfectly by the dozens of recording devices in the front rows. You wired his retirement to my company to cover your fraudulent margins, DeAndre. That money is gone. The finality of those words slammed into the altar like a physical weight. DeAndre's mouth opened and closed in rapid succession. He was completely out of oxygen, out of lies, and out of other people's money. The printed financial record I had pressed against his chest slipped from his numb fingers. It fluttered through the chilled air of the ballroom and landed face up on the marble floor, right next to the crushed white orchids of Madison's ruined bouquet. Richard stared at the piece of paper. His brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe. Apex Data Solutions, the corporate entity that had foreclosed on his beloved Aspen estate, the aggressive fintech firm that now owned DeAndre's toxic institutional debt, the company that I, his supposedly disgraced and aimless daughter, had just claimed as my own. You, Richard breathed. The single syllable was raspy and broken. You are Apex Data Solutions. I founded it 5 years ago, I replied, my voice projecting with the calm, lethal authority of a seasoned executive. While you and Susan were busy telling your country club associates that I was a lost cause, wandering aimlessly abroad, I was building a financial empire from a rented studio apartment. We specialize in acquiring and restructuring toxic institutional debt. We hunt for reckless, over-leveraged accounts exactly like the fraudulent margin portfolios your future son-in-law was using to fund his leased sports cars and fake hedge fund. The realization finally broke through Richard's shock. If DeAndre was a fraud and DeAndre's firm had been liquidated, the story about the Vanguard funds being temporarily locked in an SEC compliance sweep was a lie. My money, Richard growled. The sound was guttural and raw. He spun toward the groom. DeAndre took a frantic, panicked step backward, his polished shoes slipping on the slick marble. He collided with Madison, who let out another sharp cry of alarm. Richard did not demand an explanation. He lunged forward, throwing his massive hands out and grabbing DeAndre by the crisp white collar of his custom tuxedo shirt. Richard hoisted the younger man upward, nearly lifting him off his feet, his face twisted into a mask of pure, violent panic. Where is my $1.5 million? Richard screamed, spit flying from his lips. You told me it was a liquidity sweep. You looked me in the eye and swore the Vanguard funds were in a secure escrow ledger. Where is my retirement fund? DeAndre clawed desperately at Richard's hands, his face turning a blotchy purple as the tight collar restricted his airway. He choked out unintelligible syllables, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Below the altar, the illusion of the perfect family completely disintegrated. Susan, the grand architect of this societal masterpiece, began to hyperventilate. Her hands flew to her chest, her perfectly manicured nails clawing at the delicate lace neckline of her designer gown. She collapsed backward into the mahogany pew, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow gasps. She looked wildly at the front rows, staring at the very people she had spent decades trying to impress. The country club elite, the corporate partners and the local politicians, were no longer a polite captive audience. The polished veneer of high society vanished. They were a crowd witnessing a spectacular historic downfall, and they were entirely captivated. No one looked away. Instead, the soft glow of smartphone screens illuminated the dim ballroom. Women in expensive fascinators and men in tailored suits raised their devices, hitting record. They captured every second of Richard screaming and DeAndre choking at the altar. Tomorrow, this footage would be the main topic of conversation at every exclusive brunch in the state. Susan's social standing was burning to the ground on camera. The panic attack quickly morphed into a desperate need for a scapegoat. Susan tore herself from the pew. She scrambled up the velvet-lined stairs, her heavy silk gown catching on the marble. Her makeup was smeared with tears, her eyes wide with a manic, unhinged energy. She did not go to her ruined husband. She lunged directly at me. David, my attorney, immediately stepped forward, his body physically blocking her path. He held up a firm hand, wordlessly warning her to keep her distance. Susan stopped just short of us, her chest heaving as she pointed a manicured, shaking finger directly at my face. "Give it back!" Susan shrieked, her voice tearing through the cavernous room. "You give that money back right now, Paige. You stole it from your own father. You set this up to ruin us because you are a spiteful, ungrateful child." I stepped around David, facing her head-on. I did not steal anything, Susan. Your golden boy wired it to a corporate debt restructuring account to cover his own illegal margin calls. I simply own the company that collected the debt. Your anger is entirely misdirected. Liar! Susan screamed, stomping her foot on the marble like a petulant child. You owe us. We gave you everything. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. We paid for your entire life. She looked frantically at the crowd, desperately trying to salvage her image by playing the ultimate victim. We sacrificed everything for her. We funded her entire education. We poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into her tuition, and she repays us by stealing our retirement. Richard suddenly snapped. He released DeAndre, letting the gasping groom drop to the floor. The mention of money ignited a fresh, desperate fury in his eyes. He marched up to stand beside his wife, trying to summon the imposing patriarchal authority he had lost just moments before. Listen to me very carefully, Paige, Richard growled, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. You are going to authorize a wire transfer returning my money by the close of business today. If you do not, I will have my lawyers file a massive lawsuit against you and your company. I will press criminal charges. I will have you arrested for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and grand larceny. You will rot in a federal prison. I looked at the two of them. They were cornered bankrupt and desperately clinging to the only leverage they thought they had left. I let out a short, sharp laugh. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, cutting through the heavy tension in the room. Sue me for elder abuse, I asked, shaking my head in sheer amusement. Richard, you are completely bankrupt. You cannot even afford the retainer for a decent paralegal, let alone a team of corporate litigators. And as for your threats, I welcome discovery. I would absolutely love for a federal judge to audit your financial records. I turned my attention back to Susan, whose tears had temporarily stopped, replaced by a look of profound confusion. And please, Susan, I continued, projecting my voice so every single guest could hear the final dismantling of their perfect family narrative. Do not stand up here and play the role of the self-sacrificing mother. You did not pay for my life. You paid for Madison's. We paid your tuition, Susan yelled, her voice bordering on hysterical. We set up that fund for you. You haven't paid my tuition in 10 years. I laughed, my voice slicing through the air like a razor. I graduated valedictorian on a full ride. That tuition fund you kept threatening me with, check Madison's closet. She drained it 5 years ago for Birkin bags and trips to Cabo. Susan stood frozen. The air seemed to leave her lungs all at once. She slowly turned her head, her neck stiff, toward her youngest daughter. Richard mirrored the motion. The sheer horror on their faces was not directed at me anymore. It was aimed squarely at the weeping bride in the center of the altar. Madison stopped crying. The delicate, victimized sobbing she had been employing just seconds prior vanished with terrifying speed. The tears dried up instantly, leaving her face a hardened mask of indignant rage. She looked from her mother to her father, and finally to me, her lips curling back in a vicious snarl. So, what if I did? Madison shrieked, the sound tearing through the silent ballroom. Susan gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Madison, your sister's college fund. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Oh, please, Madison scoffed, rolling her eyes and swatting her mother's outstretched hand away. Paige was always going to get a scholarship. She spent her entire high school career locked in her bedroom studying like a complete loser. I actually had a social life to maintain. I had a standard to uphold for this family. Richard stepped forward, his face a mixture of betrayal and utter bewilderment. You stole from your own family to buy handbags. I was investing in my future, Madison screamed right back at him, leaning forward aggressively. Her pristine white veil slipped off her shoulders, dragging on the floor behind her. You and Mom drilled it into my head every single day. Look perfect, act perfect, marry rich. Do you have any idea how much it costs to run in those circles? You expected me to land a Wall Street executive to secure this family's precious legacy while carrying last season's Prada. I did what I had to do because you two were too incompetent to maintain your own wealth. The crowd of elite guests erupted into chaotic murmurs. Smartphones were practically shoved into the aisle to capture the pristine golden child ripping her parents apart. Madison did not care. The illusion was gone, and with it went any need for her sweet innocent facade. She pointed a manicured finger at her father's chest. "You are the one who failed, Dad. You went broke. You remortgaged the Aspen house and lost it because you are a terrible businessman. Don't you dare stand there and judge me for doing whatever it took to survive your financial incompetence." She spun around, her heavy silk skirt swirling around her legs, and locked her furious gaze onto DeAndre. He was still leaning heavily against the wooden podium, clutching his throat, his chest heaving as he tried to process the total collapse of his scam. He looked up at his bride, his eyes wide and pleading. "Madison, baby, listen to me," DeAndre wheezed, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "We can fix this. I have offshore accounts. I have other investors. We can still have the life we planned." Madison stared at him. The disgust radiating from her was palpable. She looked at the man she was supposed to vow her life to, the man she had proudly paraded in front of her country club friends for the past year, and saw nothing but a worthless liability. "Fix this," she repeated, her voice dropping to a lethal, venomous hiss. "You owe her $4 million. Your firm is liquidated. You don't have offshore accounts, DeAndre. You are a completely broke fraud." "Baby, I love you," DeAndre pleaded, taking a shaky step toward her. "Love?" Madison shrieked, the word tearing from her throat like a curse. "You think I care about love? I tolerated your boring finance stories, your arrogant friends, and your obsessive need for control because you promised me a penthouse in Manhattan and summers in the Hamptons. I married you for the money, and you have absolutely nothing." Madison reached down and snatched the crushed remains of her bridal bouquet from the marble floor. The white orchids were bruised, the stems bent and broken. With a primal scream, she lunged at DeAndre. She swung the heavy floral arrangement like a club, smashing it directly across the side of his face. DeAndre cried out, throwing his arms up to protect himself, but Madison was relentless. She hit him again and again, the wet, ruined orchids slapping against his custom tuxedo, green stems snapping and flying across the altar. "You ruined my life!" she screamed with every strike. "You ruined my wedding! You are a parasitic lying fraud!" DeAndre stumbled backward, tripping over the hem of her trailing veil. He crashed into the towering floral archway behind the podium. The structure wobbled precariously before collapsing forward, raining a shower of white roses and heavy wooden lattice directly onto his head. He crumpled to the floor, buried beneath the wreckage of the wedding he could never actually afford. Madison stood over him, breathing heavily, the destroyed bouquet clutched tightly in her fist. Her perfect hair was in disarray, her makeup completely ruined. She looked absolutely unhinged. She turned her furious, wild eyes back to the crowd, ready to scream at the guests who were eagerly filming her breakdown. But before she could utter another sound, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open. The sudden noise echoed like a gunshot, freezing everyone in their tracks. The murmurs in the crowd instantly died. Madison dropped her arm. Richard and Susan turned sharply toward the entrance. Even DeAndre stopped groaning beneath the collapsed floral arch. Through the tall, arched, stained glass windows lining the back wall of the venue, sharp, rhythmic flashes of light began to pulse. Blue and red, blue and red. The harsh, strobe-like colors cut through the soft, romantic candlelight of the ballroom, painting the terrified faces of the guests in alternating shades of emergency. The heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom stood wide open, framing two tall men in dark, nondescript suits. They did not look like wedding guests. The gold badges clipped to their belts caught the alternating red and blue flashes reflecting off the stained glass windows. They stepped over the threshold, their heavy tactical boots thudding against the pristine white aisle runner. A burst of static from a police radio cut through the stunned silence of the room, sharp and unforgiving. The arrival of federal authorities broke the spell that had kept the audience paralyzed in their seats. The collective realization that this was no longer a scandalous family dispute but an active federal crime scene swept through the pews like a shockwave. The mass exodus began instantly. The loyalty of high society is entirely dependent on proximity to power and strict avoidance of subpoenas. Board members, managing partners, and politicians scrambled to their feet, grabbing their designer coats and cashmere wraps. They shoved past one another, abandoning their half-finished glasses of vintage champagne. Aunt Martha and Uncle Frank bolted down the side aisle without so much as a backward glance. Susan's closest socialite friends, the women she had spent months bragging to about this spectacular event, practically trampled each other to reach the rear exits before the authorities decided to lock down the venue. The grand $1 million wedding dissolved into a chaotic, humiliating stampede. At the altar, DeAndre finally registered the reality of the two detectives marching purposefully toward him. The desperate bravado he had tried to weaponize against me evaporated entirely. Pure, unfiltered panic seized him. He looked at the detectives, looked at the exits being clogged by fleeing guests, and made the worst possible decision. He decided to run. DeAndre abandoned his bride, shoving past the terrified bishop, and sprinted toward the catering exit on the left side of the altar. His custom Italian leather shoes, entirely unsuited for a high-speed escape, slipped wildly against the polished marble. He was gasping for air, his arms pumping, as he bounded down the velvet-lined stairs. He did not make it far. In his blind panic, DeAndre failed to notice the massive cascading arrangement of white roses and heavy wooden lattice that had collapsed onto the floor during Madison's violent assault. His right foot caught firmly on a thick wooden support beam hidden beneath the crushed petals. He pitched forward with a startled yell. He threw his hands out, but his momentum was too fast. DeAndre face-planted onto the unforgiving marble floor with a sickening, heavy thud that echoed over the sound of the fleeing crowd. He slid 2 feet across the slick surface, coming to a halt directly in front of the front row pews. The two detectives did not break their stride. They descended the altar steps and reached him before he could even attempt to push himself up from the floor. One detective planted a heavy knee squarely between DeAndre's shoulder blades, pinning the ruined groom to the marble. DeAndre let out a pathetic, breathless wheeze as his arms were forcefully wrenched behind his back. The distinct, sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly in the cavernous space. DeAndre Vance, the lead detective, stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he hauled the struggling man upward by his biceps. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and multiple violations of the Securities Exchange Act. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it. DeAndre was hauled to his feet. His expensive tuxedo jacket was torn at the shoulder. His bow tie hung limply around his neck. His face was scraped, bleeding, and covered in crushed flower petals. He looked wildly around the room, searching for a lifeline, but the room was empty of supporters. The wealthy guests he had scammed were gone. Richard and Susan stood frozen by the pews, staring at him with absolute, unadulterated revulsion. The detectives turned him around and began marching him back down the center aisle directly over the white runner he was supposed to walk down as a newlywed. Madison was left standing completely alone at the center of the ruined altar. Her veil was ripped, her makeup was smeared in dark, wet tracks down her cheeks, and her hands were empty. She watched her groom get hauled away in handcuffs. She looked down at her parents, who were financially ruined and socially radioactive. The empire of fake wealth and entitlement that she had banked her entire existence on had been thoroughly dismantled in less than 20 minutes. She turned her head slowly and looked at me. She looked at the sister she had spent a lifetime mocking, the sister she had stolen from to fund her superficial lifestyle. The sister she had just discovered was the sole owner of a multi-billion-dollar financial technology firm. The pivot from furious entitlement to absolute desperate groveling was instantaneous. The sheer survival instinct of the golden child took over. She realized I was the only person left in the room who possessed the capital and the power she worshipped. Madison let out a loud, theatrical sob and scrambled down the altar steps. She threw herself onto the floor directly in front of me. She dropped to her knees, reaching out with trembling, desperate hands to grab fistfuls of my simple, sensible skirt. "Paige, please," Madison wailed, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "You have to fix this. You have the money. You are a billionaire, Paige. Write a check. Pay off those detectives. Pay off the bank. You can save my wedding. You can save everything. Please, Paige. I am your sister. You have to save me." I looked down at her tear-soaked face, at her white-knuckled grip on my clothing, and at the absolute desperation radiating from her broken posture. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a lecture or a final insult. I simply took one deliberate, measured step backward. The fabric of my skirt slipped effortlessly from her grasp. Without my support holding her up, Madison tipped forward, her hands sliding uselessly against the air, and fell flat onto the cold, hard marble floor. Madison's palm slapped against the polished marble with a sharp smack. She lay there, a heap of ruined white silk and shattered entitlement, sobbing into the cold floor. Susan finally unfroze, rushing forward with a distressed cry to gather her favorite daughter into her arms. They huddled together, a pathetic tableau of ruined high society, while the flashing blue and red lights from the courtyard painted their tear-stained faces. The detectives marched DeAndre past the front pews. He did not look back. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, sealing his fate and leaving a suffocating silence in the ballroom. The few remaining guests, those too morbidly fascinated to flee, stood in hushed clusters, their eyes darting between the weeping bride and the disgraced patriarch. The sharp, purposeful click of hard-soled shoes broke the quiet. A tall, impeccably dressed man holding a digital payment terminal and a thick leather folio marched down the center aisle. It was Henri, the general manager of the estate. His usual obsequious smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, hard panic. He bypassed Madison and Susan, entirely stopping directly in front of Richard. "Richard," Henri said, his voice clipped and entirely devoid of the deferential tone he had used all evening. "We have a catastrophic problem." Richard waved a trembling hand, trying to summon a shred of his former authority. "Henri, for God's sake, have some tact. You can clearly see we are dealing with a family emergency. Have your staff clear the room." "My staff is currently threatening to walk out," Henri snapped, stepping closer. "I just received an alert from our payment processor. The wire transfer DeAndre Vance scheduled to clear at the start of the reception has been flagged and reversed by federal authorities. Every single credit card on file for this event has been frozen. You currently have an outstanding balance of $312,000. Richard stumbled back a half step. "That is DeAndre's responsibility. Take it up with him." "DeAndre Vance is currently in the back of a federal vehicle," Henri countered, his voice rising in volume. "You signed the venue contract as the secondary guarantor, Richard. The caviar, the imported orchids, the top-shelf liquor, the string quartet. All of it was provided based on your signature. I need an alternative method of payment right now." "I do not have it," Richard hissed, his face flushing a deep, dangerous red. "You will have to bill me." "I am not billing a man whose primary residence was just foreclosed on by Apex Data Solutions," Henri shot back. He gestured sharply toward the front entrance where the police cruisers were still parked. "I have officers sitting right outside my front doors. If you cannot produce a valid form of payment for the services rendered tonight, I will walk out there right now and have you formally charged with theft of services. You will leave this venue in handcuffs just like your son-in-law." The threat hung in the air, absolute and terrifying. Richard's jaw slackened. The reality of a prison cell, of wearing a jumpsuit instead of a bespoke tuxedo, finally cracked the last of his arrogant armor. He patted his pockets in a pointless, frantic gesture, as if a spare $300,000 might magically appear in his jacket. Susan looked up from the floor, her eyes wide with fresh horror. "Richard, do something. They cannot arrest us. We are country club members. We know the mayor." "The mayor left 10 minutes ago through the kitchen exit, Susan." Richard snapped, his voice cracking with hysteria. "They were out of options. They were out of favors." And then slowly their heads turned. They looked at me. The absolute audacity of what passed between their eyes was staggering. For 10 years, they had treated me like a humiliating secret. They had banished me to the basement during their lavish dinner parties because my thrift store clothes did not match their aesthetic. They had forced me to take out crippling student loans while buying Madison a brand new Mercedes for her sweet 16. They had invited me to this wedding solely to seat me by the kitchen doors and mock my supposed lack of success. Yet now, facing the very real prospect of a jail cell, their parental entitlement overrode their shame. They looked at the daughter they had abused and saw a walking, breathing ATM. Richard swallowed hard. He took a hesitant step toward me, forcing his facial features to soften into a grotesque imitation of fatherly warmth. "Paige," Richard said, his tone entirely transformed. It was pleading, desperate, and sickeningly sweet. "Paige, sweetheart. You heard the man. This is a misunderstanding. A temporary cash flow issue. You said yourself your company is highly successful. Susan scrambled up from the floor, leaving Madison crying on the marble. Paige, you have to help us. We are your parents. You cannot just stand there and watch us get arrested. It would ruin our reputation forever. Please, Richard begged, gesturing to the manager. Just put the venue on one of your corporate cards. We will pay you back. I swear to you, we will make it right. You are a billionaire. 300,000 is nothing to you. It is pocket change. Save your family. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch. I watched the beads of sweat form on Richard's forehead. I watched Susan's hands shake. A few feet away, a bewildered catering waiter stood frozen against the wall, holding a silver tray with a few remaining crystal flutes of vintage champagne. He was staring at the scene, too terrified to move. I did not answer my parents. I walked past Richard, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I approached the frozen waiter and gracefully lifted a single flute of champagne from his silver tray. I turned back toward the center of the room. I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out a heavy matte black American Express Centurion card. The sleek metal caught the flashing police lights from the windows. I walked directly up to Henri, the venue manager. He stared at me, his eyes dropping to the black card in my hand. Terminal, I commanded quietly. Henri blinked, startled, then quickly held up the digital payment terminal. I tapped the heavy metal card against the screen. A sharp beep echoed in the quiet room, followed immediately by the green flash of an approved transaction. That $15 covers my single glass of champagne, I told Henri, my voice crystal clear. I took a slow sip of the sparkling wine, letting the cool liquid wash over my tongue. I lowered the glass and turned my gaze back to Richard. His eyes were locked on the payment terminal, his face a mask of absolute paralyzing dread. Like you said to me at the restaurant, Dad, I stated, offering him a cold, razor-sharp smile. I am not paying for this. I turned my back on the terminal, the flashing green approved screen serving as the final punctuation mark on my relationship with my family. The heavy silence that had fallen over the altar shattered the moment I took my first step down the center aisle. Behind me, the panic erupted into a full-blown symphony of despair. Richard completely lost whatever shred of aristocratic dignity he had left. He grabbed Henri by the lapels of his suit, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch as he begged for a payment plan. A grace period, anything to stop the manager from waving down the police officers stationed in the courtyard. Henri shoved Richard away with absolute disgust, signaling for the venue security to lock down the catering exits. I did not look back at them. I kept my gaze fixed on the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. The rhythmic, sharp click of my heels against the polished marble floor cut through the screaming. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught my final glimpse of Madison. The golden child of the family was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by the crushed white orchids she had used to beat her fraudulent groom. Her custom designer gown, a $50,000 masterpiece of French lace and silk, was stained with smeared makeup and dirt from DeAndre's shoes. She was entirely alone. Her bridesmaids, the country club heiresses she had spent months impressing, had abandoned her the second the word embezzlement echoed across the room. Her parents were too busy fighting off criminal charges for theft of services to even look at her. The standard she had sacrificed my college fund to uphold had evaporated, leaving her with absolutely nothing but a massive unpaid bill and a ruined dress. I reached the double doors and pushed them open, stepping out of the stifling, perfume-heavy air of the ballroom and into the crisp, cool reality of the evening. The transition was instant. The manic, suffocating chaos of my family's financial ruin was muffled the second the heavy doors swung shut behind me. The grand courtyard of the estate was serene, bathed in the soft glow of wrought iron gas lamps. The only disruption to the quiet night was the harsh, rhythmic pulsing of red and blue lights reflecting off the towering stone fountain. 2 federal vehicles were parked at aggressive angles near the front gate. I stood at the top of the grand sweeping staircase and watched the final act of DeAndre's elaborate scam play out. The 2 detectives who had pinned him to the altar were frog marching him across the cobblestone driveway. DeAndre's bespoke tuxedo jacket was torn at the seam, hanging off his shoulder like a dirty rag. His hands were securely cuffed behind his back, the metal glinting under the police lights. He was weeping openly, his chest heaving with heavy, pathetic sobs as the officers shoved him unceremoniously into the back of the cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing him inside a dark, confined reality that no amount of offshore wire transfers or fake hedge fund accounts could buy him out of. My private driver, recognizing me on the steps, pulled my sleek black sedan up to the curb, gliding smoothly past the exiting police vehicles. He stepped out, rounding the hood to open the rear passenger door for me. I descended the stone steps, taking a deep breath of the clean night air. For 10 years, the weight of their expectations, their insults, and their financial abuse had sat heavy on my chest. Now I felt incredibly, wonderfully light. I reached the car and placed my hand on the open door. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors of the venue burst open behind me. "Paige, stop, wait!" The frantic, hysterical voice echoed across the quiet courtyard. I turned slowly. Susan was sprinting down the stone steps. She had abandoned her high society decorum entirely. She was hiking up the heavy skirts of her silk mother-of-the-bride gown, her expensive heels clattering dangerously against the stone. She nearly tripped twice, her arms flailing as she desperately closed the distance between us. She reached the driveway, gasping for air, her face streaked with ruined mascara. She lunged forward, her hands hovering just inches from my coat, afraid to actually touch me, but desperate to keep me from getting into the car. "Paige, please!" Susan choked out, her chest heaving. The sheer terror in her eyes was profound. "You cannot leave us like this. They are going to arrest your father. Henri is calling the local precinct right now. We have nothing. DeAndre drained the Vanguard accounts. We took out a second mortgage on the main house to pay for Madison's engagement party, and the creditors are already calling. We are going to lose the house, Paige. We are going to be on the street." She clasped her hands together, holding them up to her chest in a gesture of absolute, pathetic submission. The woman who had banished me to the darkest corners of her life because my existence was an embarrassment was now begging on the cobblestones. "Let us stay at the Aspen house." Susan pleaded, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "You own it now. Just give us the keys. Let us live there until Richard can figure this out. You have so much money. You do not even use that estate. We are your family. I am your mother. You have to give us a place to live." I looked at her shaking hands, at the utter destruction of her carefully curated vanity, and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no familial obligation. I reached out and gently pushed her trembling hands away from the doorframe. I met her tear-filled eyes with a calm, unbreakable gaze. "Try an Airbnb," I stated, my voice smooth and perfectly flat. "I hear they are lovely this time of year." I stepped into the luxurious leather interior of the car and pulled the heavy door shut. The soft click of the lock sealing was the final sound I heard before my driver pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving Susan standing in the flashing red and blue lights of her own ruin. The soft hum of the sedan's engine was the only sound in the cabin. The heavy tinted windows filtered out the chaotic flashing lights of the police cruisers, turning the scene of my family's ruin into a distant, muted blur. I leaned back against the plush leather seat and watched the grand iron gates of the estate disappear behind us. For the first time in a decade, my chest did not feel tight with the suffocating weight of my parents' expectations or my sister's calculated cruelty. The air inside the car felt remarkably clean. My clutch vibrated, then it vibrated again. A continuous, desperate buzzing against the silk lining. I retrieved my phone and unlocked the screen. The notifications were cascading down the display like a panicked waterfall. The text messages were a predictable blend of entitlement rage and sudden pathetic bargaining. "Richard, answer your phone immediately. This is not a game. I am your father and I demand you fix this right now. Henri has called the local precinct. Richard, they are taking my statement. Tell them you will cover the damages. Paige, do not do this to your family. Madison, he is gone, Paige. DeAndre is in a police car. The dress is ruined. Everyone left. Why did not you pay the bill? You are a billionaire. You ruined my wedding. Madison. Please, Paige, I have nowhere to go. My credit cards are declining. Call me back. Susan, Paige, you have to turn the car around. We are going to lose everything. Just give us the code to the Aspen house. We will stay out of your way. I promise. I read each message with a clinical, detached curiosity. There was no spike of adrenaline, no habitual urge to appease them, no familiar guilt clawing at my throat. They were strangers screaming into a digital void. I tapped the contact name for my father. I scrolled to the bottom of his profile and pressed block. The influx of his demands vanished instantly. I did the exact same for Susan, cutting off her hysterical pleas for the mountain estate. Finally, I opened Madison's thread. Her final message was a disjointed string of typos and desperation begging for a wire transfer to a new bank account. I tapped block. The vibration stopped completely. My phone went delightfully perfectly silent. The quiet allowed my mind to wander back over the jagged path that had led me to this leather seat. 10 years of calculated, systematic isolation. I remembered sitting in the damp, unfinished basement during my parents' lavish holiday dinner parties, explicitly ordered to stay out of sight, because my clearance rack sweater did not align with the elite country club aesthetic Susan had meticulously curated. I remembered the day Richard outright refused to co-sign my student loans, claiming an investment in my education was a poor allocation of capital, while simultaneously writing a massive check for Madison's brand-new luxury sedan. They had cast me as the invisible scapegoat, the designated failure meant to make their golden child shine brighter. Yet sitting here now as the sole owner of a financial technology empire, I realized a profound truth. I had not destroyed my family. I had not plotted a grand theatrical revenge to strip them of their wealth, their home, and their social standing. I had simply stepped out of the way and let gravity do the heavy lifting. Their own unchecked vanity had blinded them to DeAndre's obvious glaring deception. Richard's insatiable greed and desire to impress his peers had made him an incredibly easy mark for a fake hedge fund manager, promising impossible returns. Susan's obsession with appearances had driven them to leverage their primary residence and sink into insurmountable debt, just to fund a superficial wedding built entirely on lies. Madison's raw entitlement had blinded her to the reality of the man she was marrying. They had constructed a towering house of cards, soaked it in gasoline, and happily handed DeAndre the match. I just refused to throw myself on the fire to put it out. The sedan turned off the main highway, gliding down a smoothly paved access road lined with manicured hedges. The bright garish lights of the city traffic gave way to the understated amber illumination of the private aviation sector. We pulled up to the gated entrance of the elite terminal. The guard recognized the license plate and immediately raised the security barrier, offering a crisp professional salute as we drove directly onto the tarmac. Waiting for me was a sleek, long-range Gulfstream jet, its engines already emitting a low, powerful whine in preparation for departure. The flight stairs were lowered, bathed in a warm, welcoming light spilling from the main cabin. My driver parked the car perfectly parallel to the steps. He rounded the hood and opened my door, offering a respectful nod as I stepped out into the cool, refreshing night breeze. I ascended the stairs and stepped into the spacious, immaculate cabin. Marcus, my chief risk officer, and the brilliant architect behind uncovering DeAndre's vast network of offshore shell companies, was already seated in one of the cream-colored leather captain's chairs. He looked up from his secure tablet, a subtle, highly satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He had been monitoring the federal wiretaps and bank freezes. He knew exactly how the evening had ended. Marcus stood as I entered the space, retrieving 2 crystal flutes from the polished wood bar. He handed one to me. The champagne was perfectly chilled, the delicate bubbles rising in a steady, elegant stream. He raised his glass in a silent toast to a flawlessly executed strategy and a closed chapter. "Where to, boss?" Marcus asked, settling back into his comfortable seat and fastening his belt. I walked over to the oversized oval window looking out over the dark, quiet tarmac. I thought of my parents likely sitting in a stark, unforgiving interrogation room by now, completely stripped of their titles, their frozen credit lines, and their false dignity. I thought of the sprawling multi-million-dollar mountain estate that I now owned completely free and clear courtesy of Apex Data Solutions, foreclosing on Richard's bad debts. A genuine, entirely unburdened smile spread across my face. "Aspen," I said, taking a slow, satisfying sip of the champagne, "I have a house to redecorate. True power is realized when you finally recognize your own worth and establish unbreakable boundaries against those who only value you for what they can extract. The defining lesson here is that shared DNA does not entitle anyone to endless financial or emotional sacrifices, especially when that family has systematically diminished your presence for years. Genuine independence requires stepping away from toxic cycles and refusing to seek validation from abusers. You must fiercely protect your peace, even if it means leaving the past behind forever. Take a stand for yourself by establishing firm personal limits today, and please comment below.